Mark Few and Mark Pope have had plenty of battles in the past, but could 4 more battles be on the table now that Pope is the new head man of the Kentucky Wildcats?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, it is a mailbag edition here of the Locked On Zags podcast. A reminder, if you want to get involved in Mailbag Monday, you can reach out to me on email at andypatton013@gmail.com. You can also join our Discord channel. There is a channel specifically in there for mailbag questions. I will post a link in the show notes to the Discord. It is free to join. You can come hang out. There's over 300 of us all talking Zags 24/7 there. All right, we're going to get straight into it here. This first question came from AD Simone 206 on Discord. This question was asked prior to the official announcement of Kentucky's new basketball coach. The question here, does the Kentucky coaching change potentially affect the series that the Zags have scheduled with them? Do you see any reason for a new coach to try and get out of or modify the series? We are using this as a jumping off point to talk about the top topic in all of college basketball right now. Mark Pope, the former BYU basketball head coach and former Kentucky basketball alumni, has officially taken the job in Lexington, replacing John Calipari, who took the job at Arkansas. We're going to talk about this coaching carousel here in a second because it is insane. Rob Lanier was fired after 2 years at SMU. Did a pretty good job with the Mustangs, led them to a 20-win season, got canned after the year. That set off a crazy sequence of events. After he gets fired, SMU hires Andy Enfield from USC. That was a bit of a surprise hire. It sounds like maybe Enfield was getting pushed out of USC after a disappointing season. Regardless, he goes to SMU as they transition into the ACC. Eric Musselman moves from Arkansas to USC, getting back home to his roots in the California, Los Angeles area. That means the Arkansas job opens up. John Calipari, leaving Kentucky after 15 years at the helm of Big Blue Nation, he heads to Arkansas. We saw Kentucky pursue a handful of candidates. They threw a bunch of money at Danny Hurley. He said, no, thanks. I'd rather try to repeat here or three-peat here at UConn. They threw a bunch of money at Scott Drew at Baylor. He said, no, thanks. I'm comfortable here in Waco. And so then they pivoted, and there was talks that they were going to try to pull Billy Donovan from the NBA, where he's the head coach of the Chicago Bulls. Of course, Billy Donovan led Florida to back-to-back championships about 15 years ago. They didn't make that call, or at least they didn't have a serious conversation with Billy Donovan. Other candidates people were expecting included Sean Miller at Xavier, Chris Beard at Ole Miss, Bruce Pearl at Auburn, et cetera, et cetera. But less than 12 hours after the official no's came through for Scott Drew and Danny Hurley, Kentucky makes their hire. They bring in their guy, Mark Pope. Of course, Mark Pope 2 years ago led BYU to a 5th place finish in the WCC, and now he's the head coach in Lexington. It feels like a wild story, and I know that there was a lot of people in the fan base who were kind of chuckling at this, thinking that Kentucky made a horrible hire, that this isn't going to work. How can somebody fail upwards from going from not doing well at BYU and in the WCC to now being the head coach at Kentucky? I think a lot of that ignores a couple things. One, BYU was really good last year, and they lost early in the tournament. And I know that's a thing that Gonzaga fans are acknowledging about BYU. It's also something that Big Blue Nation and Kentucky fans are certainly weary of. Mark Pope has yet to win a game in the NCAA tournament. Not like John Calipari's last 5 years have gone particularly well in terms of winning games in the NCAA tournament either. Worth acknowledging that BYU has finished higher than Kentucky in the Ken Pom rankings in 3 of the last 5 years. So certainly something's working for Mark Pope. I think beyond that too, I mean, this is a man who bleeds Kentucky blue. He was the team captain on this team that won the national championship back in 1996. He was their team captain. He wasn't their best player, but he was their team captain under Coach Rick Pitino. Pitino really aggressively told Kentucky AD Mitch Barnhart to pursue Mark Pope. He said, this is your guy. You got to go get him. This is the guy you want leading your program. So I think Mark Pope loves Kentucky. He wants to be there. He killed it at his first press conference. I'm recording this just about 2 hours after that press conference ended. He came out holding the 1996 championship trophy with a bunch of his teammates from that 96 team. He got the whole place fired up. Honestly, I think this is going to be a good hire for Kentucky. I think this is going to work. I know there's some Zags fans out there laughing at me, thinking, oh, they were fifth in the WCC 2 years ago. Like I said, dramatically improved the next year in the Big 12, beat Kansas at Fog Allen Fieldhouse, beat Baylor, beat Iowa State. This is a good BYU team. Mark Pope was a very good coach. I think he's going to do good things at Kentucky. To get to the actual question, I use that as a roundabout way to give you some context there. I don't see why Mark Pope would stop this series. He didn't get directly asked about it at his press conference, nor did I expect that he would. But that would be a surprise to me if he were to cancel this series. For starters, it's a benefit for both programs. This is not a bad series for Kentucky. So I think that I don't see why he would push it to try to add more games. It just doesn't really make sense. So I expect this to continue. I don't have any inside information that it is for sure going to continue, but that is my hunch, is that Mark Pope wouldn't be a coach who would cancel this series for Gonzaga, and that we're going to have this over the next 4 years. Hopefully Mark Pope does well enough to last that long at Kentucky, but we will certainly see what that looks like. There's another question from Jeff that asked about Dan Monson specifically. I think it was submitted before the latest news on Dan Monson. So I'm going to use this question to talk about that as well. Dan Monson, new head coach at Eastern Washington University. What a story. What a story this is. Dan Monson, of course, the head coach for the Gonzaga Bulldogs in 1999 when they went on their miracle run and beat Florida, and the slipper still fits and everything, the catalyst for Gonzaga becoming the program that they are. They were led by Dan Monson. He then took the job at Minnesota, did what every coach does for the most part, took a bigger job when given that opportunity. He said he got paid more at Minnesota than he'd get paid for 3 years at Gonzaga at the time. Nobody knew Gonzaga was going to become Gonzaga. I don't blame him for doing that, for making that move. Certainly worked out for both sides now, as of course Gonzaga let Mark Few took over, and the rest is history. But Monson was 7 years at Minnesota, 17 years at Long Beach State, got fired before the Big West Conference tournament, decided, screw it, I'm going to lead this team to the NCAA tournament, rattled off a couple wins in the Big West tournament, got a 15 seed in the NCAA tournament, played Arizona and Tommy Lloyd. Incidentally, of course, Arizona and Long Beach State and Gonzaga were all in Salt Lake City. So Mark Few, Dan Monson, Tommy Lloyd, all getting to hang out in Salt Lake City for the first round of the NCAA tournament. That's kind of a fun story. And now Monson gets hired at Eastern. He gets to come home, back to the place, back to the city, or back to the region, I guess. Technically Cheney and Spokane are not the same, but back to the same area where his career got started, really. He'd been at UAB before he got hired at Gonzaga, but this is where his first head coaching job was. And it's just so fun to see him back. Eastern needed a coach. David Riley took over at Washington State after Kyle Smith bounced to Stanford. So they were in need of a coach, obviously bringing in somebody who's been to multiple NCAA tournaments, who's incredibly familiar with the area. It just feels like a win-win here for all parties involved. I'm incredibly excited for Dan Monson. We got a question about scheduling that we'll get to a little bit later in the show. I don't know if Gonzaga and Mark Few are going to schedule Eastern Washington and Dan Monson. Mark has been very hesitant to schedule coaches or to schedule against coaches that he's previously worked with. Typically, that's been coaches who worked under him, like Tommy Lloyd, like Leon Rice at Boise State. They have yet to play each other. Mark Few has indicated he does not want to play Boise State. I don't think he wants to play Tommy in Arizona either. They may meet up in the battle for Atlantis. They may eventually just have to play each other. They're two premier West Coast programs, but they haven't up to this point. And I wouldn't be surprised if that continues, but I think Gonzaga and Eastern Washington should play each other. And I hope that they decide they want to do it, but it's not something I know for sure at this point, but definitely would be fun, even if it doesn't happen. Just fun that we get the other team in the Inland Northwest that we get to root for is coached by a former Gonzaga coach in Dan Monson. Well, folks, defense wins championships. That's the phrase, that's the saying. And is Gonzaga's good enough, or does something need to change? We're going to talk about that and more. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, which has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster, and they do it for free. Thankfully, LinkedIn is not just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, making it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you cannot find anywhere else. And LinkedIn does all that while making the process both easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. And LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and they may not have the time or the resources to hire. So they're constantly finding ways to make this process easier. For example, they just launched a feature that helps you write your own job descriptions. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still the Locked On Zags podcast. We're still going through Mailbag Monday here on this Monday edition of the podcast. This next question comes from BD Brownie on Discord, who says, defensively, how can this team elevate in a way to have that not be a leading concern for their title hopes next season? Are there any specific players you see that could or need to make a big leap in their defensive game? Or do you think general improvement across the board will elevate this team's defense enough? I think you kind of need it to be everybody elevating their game. To which I say, I don't think that one particular player taking a massive leap defensively is enough. I think multiple players need to improve. I think there could be some schematic things, and frankly, Mark Few hasn't been willing to make some of those schematic changes. This team is very intentional about hedging on the screens and going around them in a way that I think sometimes they might need to be more fluid, more flexible with how they run that defense. And I think that there have been teams that have kind of gashed them because of that. But when Gonzaga's had their best teams, when they've gotten a national championship, it is because of elite individual defensive performers. Jalen Suggs was a phenomenal defensive player at the guard position for Gonzaga in that 2021 team. That team wasn't even that great of a defensive team overall. Personnel-wise, Corey Kispert and Drew Timme struggled defensively in the front court, and that's what Baylor was able to do, was just crush them in the pick and roll. But that team made it because they had an unbelievably elite offense and a great perimeter guard defensively in Jalen Suggs. The 2017 team was more balanced, very good defensively, great front court defense from Shemek Karnowski. Jonathan Williams was a tough physical player. Zach Collins, Nigel Williams-Goss is a good defender on the perimeter. Like, that was a very good, balanced team. But for this team, it's going to be just individuals taking leaps. Dusty Stromer is going to need to take a leap defensively because I don't think Steele Venters is going to be more than a average capable defensive player on the wing. Ben Gregg needs to take a leap. Graham Ike and Braden Huff need to take a leap. We'll talk about that. Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman are just capped by their size. They're just not very big guards. So while they are fine defensively, I think Nolan Hickman's a pretty good on-ball defensive player. They're just limited in their ability to impact the game because they don't have that length and that size. Michael Ajayi is the wild card. Could be a really good defensive player. We didn't get to see it because Pepperdine ran an awful defensive scheme and he was only there for 1 year. He's a good athlete. Great athlete even. He's got great size. I think he could be a big-time defensive player for Gonzaga, and he, to me, is the catalyst, the X factor, the wild card in terms of determining this team's defensive ceiling. This next question is another one from BD Brownie. It's on the same kind of theme, so I'm going to roll with it here. He says, if you had to pick one element of one player's game to develop in a sizable way in the offseason, who or what would that be to help next year's team the most? So yeah, lump these questions together because I'm picking Braden Huff and I'm picking his interior defense. And I wanted to not just say Braden Huff defensively because that felt too vague and kind of outside the spirit of the question. So I'm going to go with interior defense. Having said that, Braden Huff also needs to work on his perimeter defense, getting caught in space, navigating screens better, some things that frankly he struggled with at times last year, but a lot of that was schematic and a lot of that was not necessarily his fault. Him and Dusty Stromer banging into each other a bunch of times in the game against Purdue was partly Braden Huff's fault, partly Dusty Stromer's fault. I will be willing to say partly Mark Few's fault as well. But for Braden, Gonzaga does not have a rim protector. And I think Braden stepping into that role would be vital for Gonzaga. And again, we're talking about picking an element of a player's game to develop in a sizable way. Braden Huff would need to go from below average as a rim protector to like great. Like if I just could make something happen, go on to, NBA Live or, the new college basketball video game and just ratchet something up to 99, like that's what I'm doing for Braden Huff, because that is an element of Gonzaga's team defensively that they just don't have. They don't have an eraser. They don't have a shot blocker, a shot alterer, rim protector, anything like that. Graham Ike's fine. He's not a bad interior defensive player, but he gets in foul trouble, and he's not a shot blocker. Anton Watson wasn't a shot blocker, and now he's out the door. Ben Gregg, he's not a shot blocker. Braden Huff could be that guy. He has the size. He has the footwork, the mobility. He just needs to be able to position himself better. He needs to not make dumb mistakes and commit fouls. That's something freshmen do pretty routinely, so that'll probably get cleaned up as he's in his second year in the system. But if I could choose to just make him great at it, make him one of the best rim protectors this team has had. They've had some great ones in Brandon Clark and Chet Holmgren and Austin Day. If he could become that level, that is probably the most singularly impactful thing that could happen to this roster. Yeah, it'd be great if Ryan Nembhard was a 45% three-point shooter. It'd be great if Steele Venters was a lockdown perimeter defender. Like, there are other examples we could use, but Braden Huff becoming an eraser would be a huge benefit for the Zags next season. Next question here comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, when the WCC men moved to a 16-game schedule, the women remained at 18 games. Is there any reason to believe that the WCC women will do anything other than play a 20-game WCC schedule in 2024-25? Yeah, I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the men's or the women's schedules here in terms of how many games they're going to play in conference. I looked for an announcement about that. Haven't seen it yet. Probably still ironing out the details on that in terms of the new additions, of course, with Washington State and Oregon State coming in. There's 11 teams in the conference. Do they play every team once? Do they play every team twice? That's a 20-game schedule. Do they play every team twice except for two teams, which is an 18-game schedule? Like, how is that going to work for them? And as Jeff alluded to, the men and the women did it differently. So I suspect the women are probably going to have a full 20-game WCC schedule. I suspect that Washington State, Oregon State, and Gonzaga will oppose that. My guess is that they will want more non-conference games because they have the opportunity to schedule some marquee non-conference opponents. Gonzaga has played in tournaments in the past. They've played teams like Stanford and other good marquee opponents, Arizona, Cal, etc., in the non-conference. I think they're going to want to continue to do that. And I suspect Oregon State and Washington State, who have just been gashed by the transfer portal this offseason. We'll have more on that in a future episode, but it has been very unfortunate that these two teams, which were very good last year, both made the tournament. Oregon State in particular was one of the best women's basketball teams on the West Coast, one of the best in Oregon State basketball history. They have lost a ton of talent in the transfer portal, and I get why. Moving from playing in the Pac-12, especially on the women's side, when you had teams like Stanford, of course, and Colorado and USC and everybody, and now to the WCC, which was horrendous last year outside of Gonzaga, I can see why some of those players are leaving. But it's frustrating because for Gonzaga, they wanted those two teams to come in and be at a super high level. They're still going to elevate the level of the conference, but not at the spot that people expected. Like I said, we'll get more into that later. But from a scheduling perspective, all three of these teams would benefit from playing less conference games and more non-conference games. However, there are 8 other teams in the WCC, and they may not see it that way. They would rather play all. If you're one of the bottom teams in the WCC, you're certainly not going to advocate for that because you might lose a game against Gonzaga, and you don't want to do that. You want to play them as much as you can. So I suspect that the women's basketball will still be will move to a 20-game conference schedule, but I don't know anything for sure. Final question of the segment here comes from Austin via Discord. Austin says, at this time, we are not expecting any further departures, and we have one open scholarship based on a current roster configuration. Which former Zag would you bring back to fill that one scholarship? This is a classic mailbag question. I love it. I get it probably a couple times in off season. In this particular question, it wasn't specified whether we're talking about an active college basketball player who's a former Zag or just of all time. So I'm going to answer both. If we're talking currently in college, it's Hunter Sallis, and it is not close. It is not close. Hunter Sallis is a great perimeter defensive player. He ballooned into an elite scorer at Wake Forest. He shot like 40-something% or just under 40% from three, was not that caliber of three-point shooter at Gonzaga. I think it was like 26% for the Zags, about 40% at Wake Forest. If he can, and at a high volume, if he can be anything like that at Gonzaga and coming back, that would be massive. He'd start. He'd probably push Hickman to the bench would be my guess. This isn't realistic, by the way. It's not going to happen, but he would be the top choice by a landslide. Oumar Ballo would be next because you get that rim protection, but him and Graham Ike would just, I don't think it works very well. Dominic Harris was good last year, but I think I'd rather have Hunter Sallis if we're going to pick one of the guards. Efton Reed, again, I'd rather have Oumar Ballo if we're going to pick one of the bigs. And if we're talking all time, I'll tell you right now, because I will get this question again this offseason. The answer to this is always going to be either Chet Holmgren or Jalen Suggs. Always. With apologies to Adam Morrison and Domantas Sabonis, and I mean, just go down and down and down the list. Kevin Pangos, Dan Dickau, Roni Turiaf, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be either Jalen Suggs or Chet Holmgren. For this iteration of the roster, I'm taking Chet Holmgren. You immediately get that huge boost of rim protection. Yes, it's difficult to play Chet and Graham together or Chet and Huff together. It would cause some roster issues, but having Chet Holmgren on this roster would make this team so much better. It's hard for me to not pick him in this situation. Well, who on this team is a future NBA player? Speaking of guys like Chet Holmgren and Jalen Suggs, we're going to talk more about that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. It is playoff time right now in the NBA and NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, right now, Gonzaga is at plus 2,500 to win it all in 2025. Folks, when the offseason opened, it was plus 3,000. The odds are already going down. So if you want to maximize your chances and your potential profit, then what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still a Locked On Zags podcast, and we are still going through Mailbag Monday here on the show. This next question comes from the winner of the Locked On Zags Bracket Challenge, Derek at Salag16 on Discord, who says, how many of the current 2024-25 Zags do you project as NBA draft picks? All right, let's get into it right now. Not an NBA draft pick at my currently that I'm projecting would be 3 of Gonzaga's 5 starters, Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, and Graham Ike. Ryan Nembhard is too small. I think he's a phenomenal player. Looked really good down the stretch last year. 6-foot guards are unless they're super, super high level scorers, are not getting drafted right now. Whether you agree with that or not, it's just a fact. Nolan Hickman, I think, is the most likely. And in fact, I've even just now saying it, I could probably move him to the maybe category. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say Nolan Hickman's in the maybe category. So we'll get to him in a second. Graham Ike is also in the not category. Again, if Drew Timme didn't get drafted, Graham Ike just doesn't have enough of a perimeter game, doesn't have enough ability to defend in space to be an NBA player in the modern game. I also say Steele Venters is a not. We'll see what he looks like this year, but I don't see it for him. He's just not versatile enough in what he brings to the game. And then the deeper bench guys, Yo Krajinovic, Stosic, and the walk-ons. Again, maybe they surprise me and have a development right now, but those 3 players in particular, the Euros, I don't see it for them. Maybe category, Ben Gregg, Dusty Stromer, and Nolan Hickman. Ben has the requisite skill set as a 6'10" player who can space the floor, who can shoot it from 3. He's improved dramatically as a ball handler. He's improved as a defensive player. I'm still not sure the full package is there right now, but if you squint, you see Killian Tilly, and you know Killian Tilly made the NBA, so you can see it with Ben Gregg. Dusty he's so raw, but if he develops, he got to get stronger. He's got to get he's got to improve offensively, show more in his bag than he has currently, but the development could absolutely be there for Dusty. And then with Hickman, I'm concerned about the size, but the shooting that we saw last year definitely gives him a better chance. For me, it's more that undersized 2 guards is there's so many of them. It's easy to find a 6'4", 6'3", 6'2" guy who can play the 2. There's just a huge abundance of them. If you're that size in the modern NBA, you have to be able to play point guard. Nolan Hickman can play college point guard at a better level than I think he gets credit for, but he's not really an NBA point guard. And that's why he's kind of a tweener that I'm not sure I see, but I'll put him in the maybe category because he showed a ton of improvement last year. And then the probably is Michael Ajayi. Michael Ajayi is going through the draft process right now. He's getting feedback already that indicates undrafted second-round pick. I suspect he's going to return to Gonzaga or return to school and come to Gonzaga. He's already indicated, for those of you who missed this, that if he does return to school, it is at Gonzaga. He has said that. He has made that clear. He's not re-entering the transfer portal. He is either NBA or Zag. I think he comes back, and I think he can do enough to potentially be a second-round pick in the upcoming NBA draft. Or not the upcoming one, the next one after his season at Gonzaga. Next question comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, what games are already set on Gonzaga's schedule for 24-25, and how might the remaining games shake out? So for the non-conference right now, for Gonzaga men's basketball, they're playing UConn at the Madison Square Garden. They're playing in the Battle for Atlantis, which is 3 games. That gives them 4 total. They'll play Kentucky in Seattle, assuming Mark Pope doesn't move that game, which we're not expecting him to do. They will play San Diego State on the road as part of that home-and-home series that started last year. They will play Washington in Spokane. So that gives them 4, 5, 6, 7 non-conference games. If we are assuming the WCC will be an 18-game schedule, and we do not know right now, but if we are assuming the WCC is an 18-game schedule, that's 25 games for Gonzaga. 6 are left. 4 of those 6 are probably bye games. 2 of them might be marquee opponents. I'll give some projections here. If we're talking marquee opponents, first of all, Arkansas would be a blast. John Calipari says, screw it, I'm going to keep playing Gonzaga every year. He may not want to after getting waxed 2 years in a row by Mark Few, but that would be super fun. And then maybe just another Power 5, Power 6, I guess Power 5 now team. Some that come to mind, Baylor would obviously be a blast with Scott Drew. Creighton, I don't think they'll do it with the Ryan Nembhard effect, but you never know. Maybe they could find a way to make that work. Would love to play Patino and St. John's. Would love to play Michigan State again. That's a team that Gonzaga has played a lot historically. There are a ton of options there. I could also see those marquee games because UConn and Kentucky and San Diego State and the Battle for Atlantis is already like a lot of really big games. I could see those opponents maybe not being quite at that caliber. Maybe it's somebody like a Mountain West team, like a New Mexico, maybe. I think Grand Canyon would be fun. I think Mark Few's been hesitant to play Grand Canyon, but I think that would be fun personally. So there's some other games that could kind of mix in there. By game-wise, it's probably going to be SWAC teams again. And I know Gonzaga fans are just kind of tired of seeing those Mississippi Valley States and the Jackson States and teams like that, but it's good for those programs. I think it's cool that Gonzaga, I mean, they're buying these games. Literally, they're paying money for these schools to come out and play them and lose. I think it's good that Gonzaga is putting that money towards these programs, which are HBCUs, and they are underfunded. And I think it's a good thing to do, even if I know Gonzaga fans they don't get excited about Texas Southern. But I mentioned earlier, I think it'd be cool to see Eastern Washington. I don't think we will. I always love if it's Seattle U. I've continued to advocate for that, but it has never been Seattle U, so I don't think it randomly will be. Maybe we'll get an Idaho or an Idaho State or a Montana, somebody kind of generally regional like that. But again, we maybe get one of those per year, and typically the rest of the games end up being those kind of SWAC opponents. So that's what I'm expecting it's going to look like again this year. Next question here comes from Austin via Discord. Austin says, Gonzaga has been considered a national powerhouse for many years now. The question is, when was that transition from mid-major Cinderella to national powerhouse? I'm going to say 2013. Maybe I'm biased because that was my senior year at Gonzaga, and it feels like a nice break of like my fandom as a student versus my fandom as an alumni. But that was also the first year Gonzaga was ranked number 1. It was the first year they earned a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament, and they got bounced early by a 9 seed in Wichita State. And then they got ruthlessly made fun of for it. Do you know what happens to national powerhouses that doesn't happen to mid-major Cinderellas? Getting crapped on by the national media because you lost a game you shouldn't lose. That to me signals you're a national powerhouse. So that to me is why Gonzaga Gonzaga ascended, because the 3 years prior to that, my 3 freshman, sophomore, junior year at Gonzaga, they lost in the second round all 3 years. It wasn't headlines. It wasn't a big deal. They were an 8-9 seed that lost to Syracuse. My freshman year, I can't remember exactly what seed they were my sophomore year, but they lost they beat Ohio State, and then they lost to BYU, that Jimmer Fredette team. They weren't, the expectations weren't there of this team needs to be in the Sweet 16. They need to be in the Elite 8. Like, why hasn't Mark Few won a title? None of that was anywhere heaped on the program at that time. They'd had some bad losses in the tournament before that had Adam Morrison crying. Obviously that had happened, but it was 2013 when at that point, going forward, I think the expectations for the program were much higher. And then in 2017, they make it to the national championship game. And from there on out, this team has been at that level. Many people don't treat Gonzaga as if they think they've been at that level for decades. They have not. They have not been at that level for that long. If you started in 2013, it has been a decade, which is tremendous. But really, it hasn't been that long that Gonzaga has been like a true national powerhouse. Final question of the show comes from Jeff via Gmail. Jeff says, to what do you think we can credit Gonzaga baseball's big turnaround this year? Can they keep it going? Could they win at nationally ranked Oregon on Tuesday? Yeah, Zag baseball's been on a roll. 7 games in a row, swept Santa Clara, swept San Francisco, got a midweek win over Washington State. And the reason is the pitching. Pitching has been incredible. They gave up 1 run in 3 games against San Francisco, 1 total run in 3 games. dominant performance on the bump for those guys. They also only gave up 3 runs in the final 2 games against Santa Clara. 5 in the first game, and then I think 2 and 1 in the final 2 games of that series. The pitching, especially the Saturday-Sunday arms, have been phenomenal for the Zags. In terms of the Oregon game on Tuesday, I've said this on the show before, and I will say it again. Tuesday baseball games are a complete crapshoot. Analyzing results from Tuesday midweek baseball games is borderline pointless. And I've tried to think of a good example for what it is in basketball. I'll say, so for baseball, basically the reason is every team has 3 starters. You have a Friday starter, Saturday guy, Sunday guy. That's like Friday guy, Saturday guy, Sunday guy. When you play a Tuesday game, you don't play any of those guys. So you're not playing all 3 of your best pitchers are not playing in that game. It's hard to, it'd be like not playing any of your point guards in a game for college basketball. It'd be like playing for the first 30 minutes of a basketball game, Gonzaga starts a walk-on at point guard. They start Joe Few, or they start Rem Bakamis or Jack Beach or whomever, and the other team is also starting a walk-on at point guard. That's the best equivalent I can come up with. It's not perfect, obviously, but it is the best I can do. So yeah, Gonzaga could beat Oregon on Tuesday, or they could get smoked by Oregon on Tuesday. I don't know. Gonzaga beat Washington State on Tuesday 22-7. That's a football score. It's not a baseball score. That's a testament to how wonky and weird these midweek baseball games are. So I don't know if Gonzaga will beat Oregon on Tuesday. I think if they do, we probably shouldn't take it as a huge sign of anything like that, of any massive thing. And if they get beat badly, or if they get beat at all, it probably shouldn't also be a sign of like a huge negative thing. Just Tuesday games, take them with a massive grain of salt. Try to use that example in your head of Gonzaga starting Joe Few for 30 minutes. Like that's the equivalent of like them starting a pitcher who is not one of their main guys on those Tuesday games. That's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We're going to be back this week with more recruiting updates. We got an update on a player that Gonzaga is pursuing in the 24 class. We'll talk about that. We got some transfer portal targets the Zags are pursuing as well. We'll also continue our season in review series, recapping every player's year for the Zags this last year and what it means for them going forward. All that coming up this week on Locked On Zags. Thanks again for making it your first listen. And until Tuesday, as always, go Zags.